Hey Libra, welcome back. I hope you're doing well wherever this message finds you. Go ahead and settle in for a moment because there's something very interesting showing up around your energy. You know, sometimes the biggest shifts don't begin with actions. They begin with a realization. And honestly, that's exactly what this feels like. Someone may be starting to see you, this connection, and even themselves in a completely different light. So let's see where this story wants to go. You know, Libra, the feeling I'm getting is surprisingly calm. Not quiet because nothing is happening. Quiet because something important is happening beneath the surface. And honestly, that feels very different. As I sit with your energy, I keep seeing someone slowing down. Not physically, emotionally, mentally. It's almost as if they've reached a point where they can no longer rush past what they feel whenever your name crosses their mind. Okay, the first card that catches my attention is the Justice card. And the moment it appears, I don't see conflict. I don't see distance. I see someone reflecting. Someone looking back over a connection with a level of honesty they may not have had before. Because for a long time, it feels like this person kept placing your connection somewhere in the background of their life. Not because it wasn't important, but because they weren't ready to fully understand what it meant. There were other priorities, other distractions, other things demanding their attention. Yet somehow, through all of it, your energy remained. And that's what seems to be surprising them the most. You never completely disappeared from their heart, even during periods when life moved in different directions. Even during moments when they convinced themselves they were focused on something else. You were still there, and lately they've been noticing that. More than ever. I have to say, this doesn't feel like somebody having a passing thought. This feels like somebody sitting alone with their own emotions and realizing that the connection they once tried to simplify has become impossible to ignore. The Justice card keeps pulling me toward that realization, because this person is asking themselves questions they weren't asking before. Questions about compatibility, questions about timing, questions about what actually matters. And somewhere inside those reflections, Libra, you keep appearing. The Two of Cups follows closely behind. And immediately the atmosphere softens. It's almost sweet. Because what I'm seeing isn't dramatic. It's not someone rushing toward a conclusion. It's someone beginning to appreciate how natural this connection feels. You know, some people enter our lives and everything feels complicated from the very beginning. There are games, confusion, mixed signals, constant uncertainty. This doesn't feel like that. When this person thinks about you, there is a sense of ease that keeps showing up, a sense of understanding, as though conversations flow differently with you, as though silence feels comfortable around you, as though they don't have to perform a version of themselves to gain your approval. And that realization is becoming more valuable than they expected. Because the older we become, the more we understand that peace is rare. Real peace, not excitement, not distraction, not temporary chemistry, peace. And somehow your energy keeps bringing them back to that feeling. I keep seeing this person imagining ordinary moments, not grand gestures, not fantasy scenarios, simple things, sharing a meal, running errands together, talking at the end of a long day, laughing over something insignificant, building routines, building trust, building a life. And honestly, that's what makes this feel important. Because people don't imagine those kinds of moments with someone they see as temporary. The Ace of Cups appears and everything becomes even softer. There is something opening here, something that may have been closed for a very long time. And I don't think this person expected it. I really don't. Because the feeling I get is that they once believed they had everything figured out. They thought they understood what they wanted, who they wanted, where they were going. Yet lately, those answers seem less certain. And the more uncertain everything else becomes, the more clear you become. It's almost backwards, but that's exactly how it feels. The Ace of Cups keeps showing me a heart making room for something new. Or perhaps making room for something it was too afraid to fully acknowledge before. Either way, there is movement. Gentle movement, but movement nonetheless. And what stands out most is how safe they feel when they imagine letting you in. Because vulnerability isn't easy for this person. There are walls here, protective instincts, old disappointments, old fears. Yet, when they think about you, those walls don't feel quite as necessary. The star appears beside all of this. And suddenly the energy becomes reflective again, hopeful, not in a loud way, not in a reckless way, but in a way that feels mature, grounded, real. It's almost as though this person has started envisioning possibilities they once refused to entertain. And every time they picture the future, you seem to be standing somewhere inside it, maybe not at the center of every image. Not yet, but you're there consistently, repeatedly. Enough that they're beginning to notice. Enough that they're beginning to wonder why. Okay, this is where things become interesting. because I don't feel like they've spoken all of these thoughts aloud. In fact, I think many of them are still unfolding privately, deep inside their own reflections, deep inside conversations they're having with themselves when nobody else is around. But something is definitely shifting. The way they look at you is changing. The way they think about your connection is changing. And perhaps most importantly, the future they once imagined for themselves may be changing too, because there is a difference between admiring someone and quietly beginning to imagine building a life with them. And Libra, that difference feels smaller than it used to, because something about this situation has become increasingly difficult for them to explain away. The Two of Swords immediately catches my attention, and honestly, it feels like somebody standing at a crossroads they never wanted to reach. Not because they don't know what they feel, but because they know exactly what they feel, and they understand that acknowledging it may change everything. You know, there are moments in life when staying undecided feels safer than making a choice. As long as no decision is made, nothing has to change. Nothing has to be risked. Nothing has to be confronted. For a while, this person seemed comfortable living in that space. One foot in, one foot out, allowing uncertainty to become a shelter, allowing hesitation to become an excuse. But something has shifted, and I keep hearing the same message over and over. They're getting tired. Not tired of you, tired of avoiding themselves. Because every time they attempted to create distance emotionally, something inside them kept pulling them back toward the same unanswered questions. Why does this connection still matter? Why does your presence still linger? Why do they keep comparing new experiences to something they felt with you? Those questions seem louder lately. Much louder. The moon appears and the atmosphere changes completely. It feels quieter, more private, more vulnerable. This card doesn't feel like confusion to me here. It feels like hidden emotions beginning to rise toward the surface. Almost like feelings they carefully stored away are becoming impossible to contain. I have to say, some of you may not realize how much this person has been processing internally, because on the outside, they may appear calm, composed, unbothered, maybe even detached. But underneath that surface, there has been an entire emotional world unfolding, a world they haven't fully shared with anyone. Not their friends, not their family, possibly not even themselves. The moon feels like late-night thoughts, unexpected memories, certain songs that suddenly mean something different, moments when your face appears in their mind without invitation, moments when they wonder what would have happened if they had chosen differently, what would have happened if they had been more honest, more brave, more available. Okay, this feels important because I'm not seeing somebody who is simply romanticizing the past. I'm seeing somebody who is finally allowing themselves to feel what they spent a long time trying not to feel. And that can be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, especially for someone who prefers certainty, especially for someone who likes to believe they are fully in control of their emotions, because emotions don't always follow logic. Sometimes they arrive long after the moment we expected them. Sometimes understanding shows up after the opportunity seemed to pass. And that's where this person appears to be standing, somewhere between what they thought they wanted and what their heart keeps showing them. The Judgment card enters and everything becomes incredibly clear for a moment, like clouds breaking apart, like a room suddenly filling with light. Honestly, this feels less like a realization and more like an awakening, because there are things this person can no longer pretend not to know. There are truths that have become impossible to ignore. One of those truths seems to involve you, the role you've played in their life, the impact you've had on them, the way you've quietly changed their perspective without even trying. I keep seeing somebody looking back at old conversations, old choices, old versions of themselves, and recognizing how much they were operating from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of making the wrong choice, fear of changing a life they had already built. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they are beginning to see how much those fears influence their actions, because when fear is making decisions, people often convince themselves they are being practical. They convince themselves they're being realistic. Yet somewhere deep down, they know the difference. This person knows the difference now. And that's why the Judgment card feels so powerful. They're starting to hear their own truth more clearly than the noise surrounding them. The Death card arrives softly, not dramatically, not destructively, almost peacefully. And what I'm seeing here is not an ending. It's the gradual release of an old version of themselves, a version that believed avoiding difficult emotions would make them disappear. A version that thought waiting long enough would provide all the answers. A version that kept choosing safety over authenticity. That version seems exhausted. Honestly, Libra, I think they're ready to put it down. There is a strange tenderness surrounding this transformation. like someone taking off a heavy coat they've worn for years without realizing how much it weighed them down. They may not have all the answers yet. They may not know exactly what comes next. But they are beginning to understand that continuing exactly as they have been is no longer possible. Something inside them is asking for honesty, real honesty, not with other people first, with themselves. And once that process begins, it becomes very difficult to stop. Because awareness changes everything. The things that once felt comfortable no longer fit. The excuses that once felt convincing no longer work. The walls that once felt necessary begin to crack. And as those walls continue to weaken, I keep sensing another realization waiting just beyond them. A realization connected to what has been influencing their choices all along. Because there may be more happening behind the scenes than either of you fully realize. And the closer they get to their truth, the harder it becomes to ignore what has been standing between their heart and the life they actually want. Because once someone begins seeing their own patterns clearly, they start noticing the patterns around them too. And that's exactly where my attention goes as I lay down the Justice card again. There is something very different about the way this person is looking at their life lately. They're no longer asking themselves, what do I want right now? They're asking, what actually belongs in my future? And those are two completely different questions. You know, a lot of people can stay in situations that don't make them happy for years, not because they enjoy them, not because they're fulfilled, but because they've become familiar. Familiarity has a strange way of disguising itself as security. It whispers, stay where you are. At least you know what to expect. But lately, that voice seems weaker. The Justice card keeps showing me somebody weighing things differently than before. They're becoming more aware of where their energy goes, more aware of who leaves them feeling drained, more aware of which conversations bring tension instead of peace. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, they're being honest about it, really honest. I have to say, some of these realizations aren't comfortable, because when people begin waking up to certain truths, they often discover they've been tolerating things they never should have accepted in the first place. The devil appears beside Justice, and immediately I feel resistance. Not from you, from the environment surrounding them. Almost like there are old attachments refusing to let go, old habits, old expectations, old dynamics that have existed for so long they became part of everyday life. And yet something feels different now, because this person isn't looking at those attachments with the same eyes anymore. What once felt normal suddenly feels restrictive. What once felt exciting suddenly feels exhausting. What once felt necessary suddenly feels optional, and that's creating tension. Not necessarily conflict with other people, but conflict within themselves. Because part of them understands where they need to go, while another part still remembers how comfortable it felt to stay where they were. Honestly, this feels like somebody standing in a room they've lived in for years and suddenly realizing the windows have been closed the entire time. The room hasn't changed, but their awareness has. And once you notice the lack of fresh air, it's difficult to ignore. The devil feels less like temptation here and more like recognition. Recognition of what keeps repeating. Recognition of cycles that never truly lead anywhere. Recognition of situations that demand energy without giving much back in return. And the more they observe those patterns, the harder it becomes to pretend they're satisfied. Because deep down, they know satisfaction and peace are not the same thing. The Six of Swords arrives and everything softens. The energy becomes quieter, gentler, almost reflective. I keep seeing someone emotionally stepping away from noise, not making a dramatic exit, not announcing anything, just slowly creating distance from what no longer feels aligned. Like a traveler who finally understands they cannot bring every piece of their past into their future. Okay, this is where I feel something important happening, because the movement I'm seeing isn't fueled by anger. It's not fueled by revenge. It's not even fueled by disappointment. It's fueled by clarity. And clarity tends to be far more powerful than emotion. When people become clear about what they deserve, they stop fighting battles that don't need to be fought. They stop proving themselves to people determined to misunderstand them. They stop chasing validation, and they start protecting their peace. That word keeps appearing, peace. This person keeps returning to it. Because the more they compare different areas of their life, the more obvious the contrast becomes. Some situations leave them feeling restless. Others leave them feeling calm. Some people create confusion. Others create understanding. Some connections feel like work. Others feel like home. And whether they realize it consciously or not, those comparisons keep leading them back toward the same conclusion. The Hermit quietly appears. And honestly, Libra, this may be the most important card in this part of the story, because I don't see somebody rushing toward a decision. I see somebody withdrawing from distractions long enough to hear their own voice again. There is wisdom growing here, not the kind that comes from books, not the kind that comes from advice, the kind that comes from experience, the kind that only arrives after disappointment, mistakes, and self-reflection. This person seems to be spending more time alone with their thoughts lately, more time observing, more time questioning, more time listening. And what they're hearing is changing them. Because when all the external noise fades away, the truth tends to become much easier to recognize. The hermit feels like somebody carrying a small light through a dark path. They can't see the entire journey yet. They don't know every answer, but they know enough to keep moving, enough to keep searching, enough to stop settling. And I keep feeling this growing awareness that certain chapters of their life are naturally reaching completion. Not because anyone forced them, not because circumstances demanded it, but because they've simply outgrown them. There is a maturity here that wasn't present before, a willingness to release what no longer serves them, a willingness to acknowledge what genuinely matters, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to stop choosing what feels familiar over what feels meaningful. Because the truth is, the picture they're creating for their future is becoming clearer. And as that picture gains definition, another realization seems to be approaching, one that has less to do with what they're leaving behind, and much more to do with who they've quietly been watching all along. Because there is something fascinating happening here, Libra. The closer this person gets to understanding themselves, the more their attention keeps drifting towards you, not in an obsessive way, not in a way that feels unhealthy. More like somebody slowly realizing that the person they thought they understood is no longer the person standing before them. The Page of Swords immediately catches my eye, and I have to say, this feels very much like observation. Quiet observation. The kind that happens when somebody becomes curious, because curiosity often arrives before action, before conversations, before confessions, before decisions. There's a sense that this person has been paying attention to you more than you realize, not necessarily reaching out, not necessarily making their presence known, just watching, noticing, gathering pieces of information, trying to understand who you've become. Because what they see today doesn't entirely match the version of you they once carried in their mind. Something has changed, and they know it. You know, sometimes growth happens so gradually that we don't notice it ourselves. We live with it every day. We adapt to it. We become it. But people who have known us before, they notice. They notice the difference immediately. And that's exactly what this feels like. This person seems surprised, not because you've become someone else, but because you've become more fully yourself. There is less hesitation around you, less need for approval, less energy spent trying to prove your worth. And honestly, that confidence is difficult to ignore. The Strength card appears and the atmosphere becomes deeply emotional, because what they're witnessing isn't perfection, it's resilience. There's a difference. Perfection impresses people, resilience inspires them. This person has started recognizing how much you've carried, how much you've overcome, how many situations could have hardened your heart but somehow didn't. And I think that's affecting them more than they expected, because strength has a way of revealing itself quietly. It isn't always loud. It isn't always visible. Sometimes it appears in the way somebody continues showing up after disappointment, the way they continue believing after setbacks, the way they continue choosing kindness when life gives them every reason not to. Okay, this feels important. Because the more this person observes you, the more they start comparing your growth to their own journey. Not competitively, reflectively. It's almost as though your evolution has become a mirror showing them what's possible. A mirror showing them where they've been limiting themselves. A mirror showing them that change isn't something to fear. And that realization keeps growing. The Nine of Pentacles appears, and suddenly I see them looking at your life differently. They don't see somebody waiting to be rescued. They don't see somebody incomplete. They see somebody standing on their own feet, building, creating, moving forward. And honestly, that may be one of the reasons they find themselves thinking about you so often lately. Because there is something incredibly attractive about a person who knows how to create happiness within themselves. Not because everything is perfect, but because they refuse to let circumstances define their entire identity. This person notices that. More than you know. They notice the way you've continued growing even when nobody was applauding. They notice the way you've built stability where chaos once existed. They notice the way you've learned to value yourself. And perhaps what surprises them most is that your independence doesn't create distance. It creates admiration. I keep feeling them revisit assumptions they once had about you. Old conclusions, old expectations, old narratives. And one by one, those assumptions seem to be falling apart. because the version of you they thought they knew feels incomplete compared to the person observing today. Honestly, some of them may even feel slightly intimidated by your growth, not because you've become unreachable, but because you've become undeniable. There's a quiet confidence around you that wasn't there before, or perhaps it was always there and they simply couldn't see it. Either way, they see it now, and they can't stop noticing it. The Queen of Swords enters and everything becomes crystal clear. This card feels so connected to your energy in this part of the story, because what I keep seeing is somebody who has learned important lessons without becoming bitter, somebody who understands their value without needing constant validation, somebody who knows what they deserve, and perhaps more importantly, knows what they no longer deserve. There is something about your boundaries that catches this person's attention, something about your clarity, your honesty, your self-respect, because they can feel it, even from a distance. They can feel that you are no longer standing in the same place where they left you. You have continued moving, continued growing, continued becoming. And strangely enough, that realization doesn't push them away. It pulls them closer. Because the more they observe who you've become, the more they begin questioning who they want to become. I have to say, this feels less like attraction and more like inspiration. There is admiration here, deep admiration, the kind that develops when somebody witnesses real growth, not performative growth, not temporary change, real transformation. And without even realizing it, you've become part of this person's internal conversation, part of the standard they're holding themselves to, part of the future they're trying to understand. Because every time they see another example of your strength, your independence, your clarity, or your self-respect, a question seems to surface inside them. A question they haven't fully answered yet, one that grows louder every time they think about you. And that question isn't simply whether they want you in their life. It's whether they are becoming the kind of person capable of standing beside someone like you. And somewhere within that realization, a decision appears to be getting closer than either of you realize. Because there comes a point where reflection is no longer enough. A point where understanding must eventually become action. And honestly, Libra, that feels like where this story is heading. The Justice card returns one more time, and the energy feels very different than before. Much more settled, much more certain. I don't see somebody wrestling with confusion anymore. I see somebody getting closer to a choice, a real choice. The kind of choice that changes the direction of a person's life, even if nobody else notices it right away. You know, most important decisions don't happen in a single moment. They happen gradually, quietly, piece by piece. One realization leads to another. One truth leads to another. Until eventually there is nowhere left to hide from what your heart already knows. And that's exactly what this feels like. This person seems to be arriving at a conclusion they never expected to reach. Not because someone convinced them, not because circumstances forced them, but because every road they've taken keeps leading them back toward the same place, back toward the same thoughts, back toward the same feelings, back toward you. The Fool appears, and immediately I feel a shift, a breath of fresh air, almost like somebody standing at the edge of a new chapter, not fully knowing how everything will unfold, not having every answer, not having every guarantee, but feeling ready anyway. And I have to say, that feels significant, because this person spent so much time trying to find certainty before taking a step, trying to eliminate every risk, trying to predict every possible outcome. Yet life rarely works that way. Love rarely works that way. At some point, faith becomes part of the journey. And what I see here is someone becoming willing to trust something they cannot completely control. There is excitement here, a little nervousness too. But beneath it all, there is hope, real hope. The kind that only appears when somebody finally stops focusing on what could go wrong and starts paying attention to what could go right. The World card appears beside the Fool, and honestly, the combination feels beautiful, because there is an ending happening here. Not the ending of your story, the ending of an old cycle, an old chapter, an old way of approaching relationships, an old way of approaching themselves. I keep feeling somebody looking back at who they used to be and realizing how much has changed. The fears that once controlled them don't seem as powerful. The uncertainty that once kept them frozen doesn't seem as convincing. The distractions that once occupied their attention seem less important than they used to. Something is completing itself naturally, like a season reaching its conclusion, like a journey finally arriving at the place it was always meant to reach. And what waits beyond that completion feels remarkably different, much lighter, much clearer, much more honest. Okay, the King of Cups enters and everything softens. This card carries such emotional maturity in this story, because I don't feel somebody being overwhelmed by their feelings anymore. I feel somebody learning how to trust them, learning how to honor them, learning how to express them. There is a huge difference, and honestly, Libra, I think that's part of what's been changing behind the scenes. This person is becoming emotionally available in ways they weren't before. Not perfect, not fearless, but available, which is often far more important. Because vulnerability isn't about having no fear. It's about deciding that something matters more than the fear. I keep seeing moments where this person almost wants to speak. Moments where words rise to the surface. Moments where they imagine reaching out, sharing something, explaining something, perhaps even admitting something. And those moments seem to be happening more frequently. The walls that once felt necessary continue getting smaller. The distance feels less comfortable. The silence feels less satisfying. Because once somebody begins understanding their emotions, they naturally want to share them. They naturally want to be understood. And I think that's becoming harder for this person to ignore. The Ace of Wands suddenly arrives, and the atmosphere changes once again. There is movement here, momentum, energy, a spark. It feels like the first step towards something, not the entire journey, just the beginning. But beginnings are powerful. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation, one message, one moment of honesty, one choice. And everything starts moving in a different direction. Honestly, I don't think this person wants to remain suspended between possibilities much longer. They've spent enough time observing, enough time reflecting, enough time questioning. There is a growing desire to experience something instead of simply thinking about it. And that's where this energy becomes exciting, because possibilities are transforming into intentions. Dreams are transforming into plans. Feelings are transforming into decisions. I keep hearing the phrase, what if? But it doesn't sound fearful anymore. It sounds hopeful. What if this could work? What if this connection deserves a chance? What if the future looks different than I expected? And perhaps most importantly, what if it's time to stop wondering and start finding out? Because there is a sincerity emerging here that wasn't present before. A willingness to be honest. A willingness to be seen. A willingness to take a risk for something meaningful. And although I don't feel that every word has been spoken yet, I do feel the distance between silence and communication becoming smaller. Much smaller, almost as though a door that has been closed for a very long time is beginning to unlock from the inside. And whatever happens after that may surprise both of you more than you realize. And Libra, whatever happens next, I think the most beautiful part of this story is that something is finally becoming honest. Not perfect, not fully written, just honest. Sometimes the biggest changes don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with a quiet realization that can no longer be ignored. And for many of you, it feels like someone is getting closer to that realization every single day. So for now, allow things to unfold naturally. Trust what feels genuine. Trust what brings you peace. And most importantly, trust yourself. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. If this message resonated with your journey, feel free to let me know in the comments. I always love hearing from you. Take good care of yourself, Libra. And until next time, keep choosing what feels real, what feels balanced, and what feels true to your heart. I'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.